Do you know that you're loved?
Zevi from Seekers of Unity. What is mysticism? Just thought I'd start you off on an easy one.
I wonder how we can collectively build an internet where what's incentivized is compassion and humanity and poetry and inwardness and silence. The internet in some ways is like this very great magnified mirror of what goes inside of us. And we have this morbid fascination with death and destruction.
If there was a movie going on and it featured all the biggest celebrities and they really died in the death scenes, they actually died, how many people do you think would see it?
Desiree podcast.
Zevi from Seekers of Unity. I am so glad to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Serene. It's really great to be here with you.
So you have this captivating YouTube channel. You talk about, I mean, you're quite a religious Jewish person. And you talk about mysticism, but what's really interesting is that you really deal with all sorts of faiths. I mean, you talk to people from like every different religious background that I can think of. And you kind of connect them all to this point of shared unity in mysticism. And one question I have is, what is mysticism? Just thought I'd start you off on an easy one.
Yeah, that's a great kind of easy question. Well, firstly, it's so nice to sort of hear back reflected the work that I'm doing with a real person that I can see at least through the screen here. You know, a lot of the work that we do in this digital space that we're in is very disconnected and disembodied and is done in isolation. So it's really nice even just to hear back what I'm trying to do from another person. So that's really sweet and very, very heartwarming. Thank you, Serene. There's a few definitions that I've landed on in my exploration of mysticism. It's troubling because there really is no consensus in contemporary academia about how the word ought to be used. There's a joke told in the field that for every scholar of mysticism, there's another definition of mysticism, which is not untrue. The two definitions which I most have connected to, one comes from an early 19th century Anglican scholar by the name of Evelyn Underhill. She defines mysticism as the art of union with reality. The art of union with reality, which is like a magnificent definition, which we can unpack. And for a bit more of a technical definition, there's a modern 20th century definition from Peter Moore, which is that mysticism comprises of three things, which is a variety of unitive experiences, a variety of unitive theories, and a variety of unitive practices. Practices which both bring the individual back into the experiences, which then, in our attempt to reconcile those experiences with our reality, generate the theories, these unitive theories of mysticism, and then the practices of how we behave in the world going forward, knowing what we know and having experienced what we've experienced. So I think between those two definitions of Moore and Underhill, that's what I get a sense of what mysticism is. It's the art of union with reality as trickled through experience, theory, and practice.
What is the opposite of mysticism?
That's a great question. I think the opposite of mysticism, and it's a funny question because if mysticism is the unitive, then the opposite we assume is going to be that which is going to be presenting or experiencing or practicing some form of disharmony, of separation, of isolation, alienation, bifurcation, fragmentation. And I think that experiences where we feel ourself as fundamentally other and separate from something else, anything at all, whether that's nature, whether that's parts of ourselves that we're alienated from, whether that's each other, individuals, families, nations, where we sense a real rift between them, or theories that tell us that we really are different than someone else in some fundamental ways, and we really can't unite with one another, and practices which instantiate those perceived differences. I think that would be the opposite of mysticism.
Excellent definition and opposite. I just came back from a 7-day. It's not a retreat. this guy, Jesse McKay, runs these intensive developmental sessions, and we go off to the Blue Mountains for a week. And it's, it's just incredibly intense. And it's kind of like spiritual therapy for 12 hours a day with like 9 other people. And, I just came back from that. And so it's at the forefront of my consciousness. And when you said the opposite of mysticism, I'm glad I asked that question, because you said, what you described was something like a fragmentation and, not being what I would describe as aligned with oneself. And I noticed in Jesse that part of this retreat was finding ways that we were triggered, like intentionally kind of being with them. So, for instance, one thing that I noticed that I did was when there was a lot of a certain type of confrontation, I would shut down, and I would like avoid eye contact with people and just like not want to talk. Like there was this heavy weight on me that didn't want to talk. And I talked to Jesse about it, and he was like, "Oh, that's like a survival strategy. Like maybe when you were a kid, the best thing to do when there was conflict was to like kind of just stay out of it and not engage too much." And survival strategy is it's not like I had a fantastic childhood, but it's more like that was maybe on the schoolyard or something. That was the strategy that you used to get by. And that was very true. And I didn't even realize I was kind of using that strategy, or that's what this was. Like it was some ingrained childhood thing. And I noticed in the whole time, Jesse, who's this like wizard. I mean, he's incredible. He didn't use anything like that. I mean, people could hurl insults at him and people really did. Like they got very angry and they said all sorts of really nasty things to him at some point, or one person did in particular. And he just kind of like took it and was very kind back and transformed the situation with this incredible grace. And to me, that is unity, with oneself and with reality. It's not having these fragments, because my like quote unquote survival strategy left me with no choice in how to interact with the world. Like once I was triggered, I just shut down and I didn't have the choice to interface with it differently. I actually did come out of that, but at that point in time. And I noticed that with you, actually. I said something earlier before this podcast that was unintentionally, afterwards I realized would have been quite triggering for a lot of people. And you interfaced with it beautifully. And you didn't show any hint of anger or resentment. And you turned it around with a lot of intellect and a lot more grace. And so, to me, you represent unity in this very compelling way.
That's very kind of you to say. I really appreciate that. I just as a disclaimer, I think there's a lot of areas in my life and within myself that I'm still working on integrating and struggling with, my own shadows and demons. And I don't want to give anyone the false impression that I've achieved some sort of perfection. I think that's an unhealthy standard or expectation. And I think being in a position of authority and teaching and leadership in this space, it's important to precisely disavow those illusions about ourselves, so that we can approach each other as peers and as humans, and learn from each other in our strengths and in our weaknesses. But I very much appreciate you seeing that, and I think that a lot of this has to do with what our fundamental assumptions are about each other, ourselves, and the nature of reality. And if we do believe in a very deep, fundamental, in a way that it may not be theological in a contemporary sense, but it certainly still has the gravity of theology. If we still believe in that, with that gravity, that there's really other and there's really evil and there's really bad out there, then we can assume that of other people. And when we assume bad of others, then we respond in kind, and we lash out, and we defend, and we don't try and see their positivity and see see the goodness. And I think that holding on to a fundamental assumption, not even of the goodness of reality, but of the commonality of reality, that we're in this together as one, then we're forced to grapple with that honestly together, as opposed to pushing someone out of the bounds of civil, loving discourse.
That reminds me of the difference between the Jewish and the Christian idea of God and Satan. And I am not very well versed in this. I think you probably know about 50 to 100 times more than I do. But my interpretation is that we have this I think pretty much everyone would know that like the Christian idea of God and the devil are that like the very separate creatures. Like the devil is this incarnate of pure evil, and the God is a goodness. And in Judaism, Satan is, as far as I can understand, is actually working for God. The metaphor that I've heard is that a king wants to test out his son, the prince, the future king. And he says, so he hires a prostitute to tempt the prince, sorry. And the prostitute will do her job to the utmost degree. She will try as hard as she possibly can to tempt the prince, but she wants him to succeed. And as far as I can understand, Satan is portrayed in this way, or yeah, it's kind of like even evil is good in disguise. But I don't know. Maybe that's not an in-depth enough understanding. I would love to hear your point of view.
No, I think that's a fair depiction, and that's a Jewish articulation based on midrashim, classic rabbinic literature that describe Satan in that way. I think often we have trouble in religion where we use the same word across religions and we assume that we mean the same thing. So we talk about Satan in Christianity, Satan in Judaism, Shaitan in Islam, and we assume that they're all the same entity, and when certainly they're not. Even when we say God, we use the one word for all three. That's still a dangerous thing to do. And I think the one thing which I'll add to what you said, but I think you summed it up beautifully there, is that the story form of the king sending a prostitute to try and seduce the son has a particular mythological register which places the story into separate personas, the archetype of the king, the archetype of the prostitute, the archetype of the son. And I think that the danger in that is that it can, while it's there to teach us a really important message, that the function of the Satan is a functionary of the king to test and perhaps strengthen the prince, and not as a separate realm of evil. What it can do still is it can still place that story outside of us, and we can forget that we are the king, we are the prostitute, we are the prince, and we are doing we are the one who sends the prostitute to test ourselves. So I think there's some updating of we need to sort of internalize the mythology once again, and that's just sort of a step that I would add, but only to add, not to detract from what you said, which I think was well said.
There's this, I don't know quite how to describe a tzaddik, but there is this branch of person in that type of person in Judaism called the Tzadik. And the way I understand it is, there's a type of really good person under the Tzadik, and I'm going with, I've done a Tanya class. I'm going with Chabad literature, but like a Beinoni is a type of person that is a really, really good person, but they still struggle, and they're maybe perfect in their actions. I'm not sure if that exists, but they still struggle with thoughts that tell them to do the wrong thing. And they successfully work with or ignore those thoughts. And then the tzaddik is a very, very rare person who has completely transformed the thoughts from Satan into God, or from like they don't appear, or they don't seem to have any sort of negative impulses. And I wonder if being a tzaddik is truly seeing Satan as God.
It's I think it's delightful how how the most finest articulations of faith sound the most heretical. There's something of a humor in the logic of theology there itself. I would say a step further even, that the tzaddik has the capacity not only to see Satan as nothing other than God, an expression of divinity, serving the function that it does, but the tzaddik is able to actually appreciate that function, and to see it as almost like as a delightful opportunity through which one can come closer to God. There's a beautiful, beautiful idea in the Jewish understanding of mitzvot, of positive actions versus avirot, negative actions, where the avira, the negative action, is shunned, is seen as something to avoid. But from the perspective of the tzaddik, and even higher than the tzaddik in some sense, the Baal Tshuva, one who is the master of returning to themselves and returning to God in the process, that all of their avirot, all of their sins, all of their misconduct actually becomes part of the positive makeup that brings them closer to divinity. In that sense, there's a cherishing of the evil itself, because the evil becomes a springboard from which one returns to reality, as Underhill puts it. There's an interesting verse in the early chapters of the book of Genesis where God says, "Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmeinu," let us make mankind in our image. And all of the biblical commentators ask, who is God speaking to in the plural? Who is our image that God is making mankind in? If God is presumably the only thing that exists before the creation of the world. And there are different answers given. One answer classically is that God is speaking to heaven and earth, that the human being is a combination of body and soul, heaven and earth, and God is speaking to them when God says in our image. But other answers that God is consulting with the angels, something that we see, in the book of Job and elsewhere. But one answer, the Medrash says, is that God is consulting with the souls of the righteous, with the souls of the tzaddikim. Which is an interesting idea because, humans are not yet created, but there's already souls of the righteous. There's sort of some interesting theology going on there. But it begs a question, because if the souls of the righteous already exist, then why create mankind at all? Why create Adam and Eve? If the souls of the righteous, seemingly the pinnacle of creation, are there, then just hang out with the souls of the righteous. Don't make this messy world of ours that needs to go through eons of pain and suffering and destruction, all to come back to maybe achieve a state of righteousness, which seems so far from us. And the answer that's given in Jewish mysticism is that God creates the world, consulting with the souls of the righteous, so that the righteous themselves may return and repent and become Balei Tshuva, become masters of return. And that is the stage where the evil itself, where Satan itself, becomes seen as not only a part of divinity, but a part of divinity which brings us closer to the divine, closer to ourselves.
I appreciate and I resonate with the mysticism aspect of this. But the question I have now is, how can somebody who's struggling with everyday issue use this for themselves? Like, let's say someone's struggling with anger, for instance. They fly into rages and scream at people they love. How can they take this piece of divinity and then use it in themselves?
I think there's two sides to answering a question like that. One is recognizing that whatever is the source of one's anger must be divine and divine willed as well, if everything is divine. And this is, I think, a very, we can put this in a Spinozistic language, that we can see reality subspecies temporalis. We can see things as we see them on a day-to-day basis, and things can anger us because they're not how we want them to be. Or we can recognize the reality of the omnipresence of divinity, of being, of reality, what Spinoza would call substance, to see things subspecies eternitatis, to see things under the aspect of eternity. And from that place, we understand that things are the way they are, and they cannot and they cannot have been any other way. And therefore, to be angry, says the Mishnah, is to serve idolatry. Idolatry, which is like the great sin in the Bible, later in Jewish mysticism is understood as any function of duality, of separating something from God. To say that there is an idol means that God is not here, right? That's what idolatry means, essentially. So if we truly believe that everything was divine, then there would really be no space for us to become angry at anything. And I'll qualify that statement in just a second. And therefore the rabbis equate anger with idolatry, because it's saying that which happened, I'm now angry at because it's not part of the divine or the divine plan. There are places, just to qualify that for a second, there are places in Jewish thought and in Jewish mysticism and elsewhere where there is righteous indignation, which is called for. Oyhavei Hashem Sinara, says the psalmist, that the lovers of God hate evil, which brings us back to our question earlier, that there may be moments where something, we can recognize that something in its source is really there to bring us closer to that which always is. And yet in the way it manifests, we can hate that. We can hate the suffering of others. We can hate the fact that there are people in this world that go through ungodly amounts of pain. And we're supposed to hate that. And our hatred should drive us to alleviate their suffering. So, that's a qualifier which keeps us from mystical pacifism, which is possible direction to go if we see everything subspecies eternitatis. That's I think the first answer. I think the second answer is to look deeper into our anger and to ask why is it coming out and where is it coming out from, and to see it itself as an expression of divinity in some sense, and to allow that to be a springboard closer to reality. And that's subtle work of really being able to once the anger has passed us, to step back and really try and unpick where that's coming from, why it's coming out, and how is that an expression of divinity. And that's challenging work. So I think the first step is the acknowledgement that all is divine, and therefore to dissipate and to regulate our anger. And then the second acknowledgement is to look at the anger itself and ask, and how is that divine?
I'm interfacing that with my own understanding of anger. And I really like your response, because I've heard something similar to, I think, part of the first response you gave, which was, and I've heard it maybe in a more basic way that wasn't as, maybe I found it too simplistic, which is like, I've heard negative representations of anger. Like, if you're angry, then I don't know. It's not. Essentially, what it boils down to me is something like, you shouldn't be angry, right? And when I hear that, the image I have is when, like, if you have a tree that has multiple branches coming out, and right before then you cut off the tree, you prune the tree right here. It stops the flow of energy, and the tree wants to continue that flow of energy. It has that energy, and so it comes out up here, and that's why you get these trees with these big shoots that come straight up, and they look a bit odd most of the time, and they're not quite right. They're not really in alignment with. It takes away a part of the tree's beauty, and oftentimes I hear this expression of like, you shouldn't be angry. And to me, it probably just gives someone another mechanism to shame and hate themselves with, rather than stopping anger. The way I see anger is, I think, more like a lot more like your second point. Anger to me is oftentimes, almost every time, or maybe every time, there's something underneath an anger, like a pain. And the anger seems to be protecting me from feeling pain or feeling more pain. Or oftentimes anger is just someone's crossed my boundary and I didn't say anything, maybe when the anger was very little, and now it's big, and I'm very angry because I didn't righteously stand up for what my anger was telling me in the beginning. Yeah, it's difficult because I feel very thankful for my anger, and it's hard for me to adopt the perspective that anger is somehow something that I shouldn't feel. Although, that being said, when I do, I don't think I expressed myself as well as I could there. The point is to resolve the anger. The point is to listen to what the anger has to say about, like, you cross my boundaries, and then assert a boundary. Especially when it's very small. When the anger is at like 5%, that's the best time to do it, because I can assert my boundary without like blowing up at someone, for instance. And so to me, the anger is also God. And I think you did express that very well. I think we're in alignment, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it sounds like that. I think maybe it's worth distinguishing kind of two sides of anger here. This space of like the anger of the righteous, the like the psalmist refers to, this like a refined anger, if we can call it, which is a tool, which is an important tool, and which is a morally necessary tool sometimes, and an effective tool. And then there's unrefined anger, and this is the same really for everything. Our passions, our desires, our the way that we spend our time and look at a tree. There's a way to do it that's within a context of realization, and a way to do it that's unconscious or unrealized. And I think that if we were to be in a world which was full of people that were angry, jealous, insecure, afraid, spiteful, in ways that were unrealized or unredeemed or unrectified or unrefined, that would be quite a uncomfortable and unpleasant world to live in. And if those same attributes and traits were able to be refined and examined and clarified and uplifted, not that they would be eradicated necessarily, but we could understand, like, why are we afraid of what we're afraid? Where is that speaking from inside of us deeply? Why are we angry about the things we're angry about? Where is there a place for sacred jealousy? And in the Jewish tradition, there's a place for all of these. There's kinasaf from Tarbe Chachma. There's the jealousy of the scribes increases wisdom. There's a place for each one of those emotions that are mirrored, according to the Kabbalists, that the 10 Sefirot, which represent all of the human emotions, manifest both in the side of holiness and in literally the other side, the Sitra Achra in Aramaic. And they're mirror images of one another. Zeh ulamat zeh bar Elokim, as the verse in Ecclesiastes says. And it's a process of bringing them over of integrating them into holiness, not abandoning or dismissing or dismantling, but rectifying them.
How do you? Oh, my first question is, I'm just throwing you all these easy questions here. My first question is, what is unrefined anger? I think that's what you called it, unrefined anger, like the one that isn't righteous. Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
You want a concrete, practical example, or you want like a
Yeah,
sort of
I think I think my brain works. I think my brain works in concrete and practical. And I also deeply. I also want to give your message to the guy who's a welder. You know what I mean? Like you have something very profound, and I would like people to be able to use it in their everyday lives.
I appreciate that. I just want to say that it's not my message, and it's not my wisdom. I'm like, if I'm doing my job well, then I'm just a conduit to the wisdom of Judaism and Jewish mysticism, and maybe also mysticism more broadly speaking, insofar as I can share that. Well, let's think in our own lives then. Let's think about a practical example of when we were last angry. We can stop for a second. You and I can think for a second, and the listeners that are joining in can think when they were angry. Let's give that a second. I have a a moment in my mind. For me, anger is often tied into a sense of injustice. And the moment that I conjured was a moment when I felt that I was unjustly treated, and maybe then, if we can theorize for a second, the distinction between a refined or rectified anger is if we were able to be equally incensed about the injustice perpetrated against at any aspect of reality, any of God's faces, as much as our own, then that would seem to me to be a rectified anger. And when our anger is restricted, isolated to our limited conceptions of self, that seems that there's still some rectifying to do, which is not to say that there aren't moments that the self and the ego needs to be angry about things and establish its boundary and borders, and it also needs to be there and survive. But when we can only get angry, let's say, about things that pertain to us, and we have complete disregard for we don't feel angry and we see someone else being maltreated, then that might point to some refining that anger still needs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really loved. I'll change the topic now. I think that was a beautiful way to finish, to wrap up that bit. I really loved your video on female Jewish mystics. That was by far my favorite that you've done, and it made me contemplate this the role of the feminine in Judaism, but also in life. Like, to me, especially in our modern society, my projection is that we tend to see a lot of women, or like society or whatever, it seems to be kind of pushing women to take on very masculine roles, in terms of like becoming the breadwinner and being competitive and being independent and things like that. And I don't think those are negative traits to have, and I have a lot of those traits, and I love a lot of those traits in myself. But to me, it seems like femininity has been equated with weakness in like modern Western society, and with negativity. And I am just now, in the last few years, starting to look for positive aspects of like that kind of, I'm looking for that kind of radiant femininity that seems so hard to define and clarify for myself. And I'm wondering what Judaism has to say about like the different roles of men and women, and how they can both flourish and find happiness and contentment in life.
That's a delightful question. Firstly, I want to acknowledge and agree with what you said, that in the contemporary world, in the attempts to elevate the status of women in society, the elevation was to elevate them to the place of the male, as opposed to seeing what it means to be feminine, and to elevate the feminine to the feminine as opposed to elevating it to the male. And I think we're beginning to see some of the decay of that attempt, and the question of what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be feminine, seems to be questions of great importance. I think there's a crisis of masculinity as much as there's a crisis of femininity. And I think in moments of crisis in modernity, we turn to ancient sources of wisdom, which may have understood these archetypes, these images, symbols, in ways that we may have lost access to in our rush into modernity. And I think that mysticism and Jewish mysticism has a lot to say about what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, and that applies to both men and women, and to people that don't identify with either, of being able to channel and get in touch with both of those internal aspects of them. Because firstly, from a Kabbalistic perspective, every human being contains both masculine and feminine, because the divine is comprised in its manifest form in both masculine and feminine. And therefore, we as expressions of divinity contain both masculine and feminine. And that's represented again through the image of the Sefirot, perhaps the most central image and symbol, or really symbolic system, of Kabbalah. It might be helpful to talk for a second about masculinity and femininity amongst the Sefirot, in an attempt to open up this discussion of what masculinity and what femininity may mean from within a context of Jewish mysticism, with your permission.
Yeah. Can you give a very quick definition of the Sefirot for people?
Sure.
I don't know if that exists.
Yeah. I gave a very quick definition on the channel, and it took me an hour. So I'll try do it even quicker.
I would say it's the aspects of the soul. I don't know if that's true though, like the different components of a soul. But I would love your definition.
Yes. No, that's certainly one way that it's used. I would say that the Sefirot are a map, and a map which primarily maps three things, and it maps them sort of translucently or transparently, where you can sort of see all three maps concurrently, like sort of stacked. And it maps the human soul or psyche. It maps reality, and it maps the divine. So it's a map of all three: the divine as the divine, manifest divinity, Deus revelatus. There's a separate, aspect of divinity, Deus aspecunditus, the hidden God, which is not comprised of the Sefirot, but God as God manifests in reality. Reality as reality manifests, and the human psyche as an expression of that, made in the image of God, are all mapped by the 10 Sefirot. Within the Sefirot, there are three channels. There's different ways of dividing the Sefirot. The Sefirot also appear in different configurations, but in the configuration that most people are familiar with, the configuration which, according to the Kabbalists, is the configuration of our contemporary iteration of reality, a state known as tikkun, a state known as partsufim, different terms to describe it. The Sefirot can be divided in that configuration in different ways, and mainly into three groupings, horizontally and vertically, three in each, horizontal and vertical. When we divide the Sefirot vertically into three groupings, we have the masculine on the right side, we have the feminine on the left side, and we have the union of the two in the center column. And the primary function of the Sefirot between left and right, between the masculine and feminine, is that the right side, the masculine side, gives, and the left side, the feminine side, receives. However, when we chart the Sefirot, when we divide them horizontally, the final Sefirah, which is the quintessence of femininity, which is Malchut, which receives from all of the previous 9 Sefirot, Malchut goes and becomes the giver again, which gives forth to Keter, of the next strata, the next iterative process of creation and creativity. So in that sense, true receptivity becomes true giving. And the biological metaphor employed by the Kabbalists, taken from the biological relationship between males and females, is that the male gives the female a seed in the act of procreation. The female receives the seed, and that happens spherotically for the Kabbalists, metaphorically, between the Sefirot of Chachma and Bina. Chachma is the seed, Bina is the womb, which expands the seed, and then gives forth the child, which is infinitely and incommensurately more than it received. The Malchut, the final Sefirah, which is this moment where the feminine is fecund and gives birth, which is a messianic moment, is also compared to the moon, which receives light from the sun and radiates that light forward to earth in times of darkness, particularly. Malchut is speech. It is the mouth. It is where it's the final. After we have an idea in our subconscious, which makes its way through our thinking, we can finally articulate our speech. It's also kingship. It's rulership. The king is seen as empty because there's no king without a people, and the people create the king, and the king speaks commands to them. So what the Kabbalists do, the Kabbalists give us a lot of images: moon, speech, mouth, kingship, birth, house, and together they're trying to draw us some sort of evocative, associative poetry of what the feminine is dancing between all of those images, and provides us an alternative set of images for the masculine. And through contrasting those, we can come up with what masculinity and femininity means for the Kabbalists, and those two sets of polarity, I think may be helpful to inform the way in which we understand and construct our own understandings of gender and sex in contemporary society. I'm speaking somewhat vaguely and abstractly here, but I'm happy to expound on any of those points. But I just want to kind of lay out the imagistic world of the Kabbalists insofar as gender is concerned.
Yeah, beautifully said. One thing about receiving, it's very interesting, without the biological metaphor, is that I suppose I've kind of done a study on like what it means to be feminine in a way. And one thing that I've noticed is that being receptive towards gifts, like there's this very, I think in the past, maybe I was perhaps like trying not to receive if somebody wanted to give me a gift. And there's this very beautifully feminine thing in accepting a gift and showing the honest, giving someone the gift of back of this honest gratitude, and letting them experience the joy of giving a gift. Because if I don't receive properly and I say, oh, you spent too much money on me, like, no, you know, it doesn't actually allow them to feel the joy of giving. And so one aspect of femininity is a further continuation of that is showing raw emotion without, like, if I were to say, like, you shouldn't have given me that gift, it was too expensive. It's kind of a command on them. which is a very masculine trait. And I'm not trying to shame myself or shame other people for doing that. It's just kind of how I would categorize things. And there's obviously room for women to give commands. I'm not saying we need to be enslaved and forced to do whatever, but I'm just kind of categorizing them into two different separate buckets. But the act of like, even if I were to say like, I'm so thankful and I feel overwhelmed at your generosity. Like that's in itself displaying the same sentiment, but from a very emotional standpoint and from a more vulnerable standpoint. And I think, yeah, femininity is receptivity in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's also, firstly, I'm genuinely glad to be able to be in touch with my own femininity in this discussion, and to see where within myself I cherish my own receptivity, and where that's a gift in my life, and also to be in conversation with someone else who's able to manifest and embody those elements. I think a lot of these conversations, at least in many worlds that I'm used to, happen between people that identify and present primarily as masculine. And I think there's something lost in those conversations. And that's something which I wanted to acknowledge firstly and be appreciative of. I think as well, it's important to, if we want to understand the image of the genders from within a Kabbalistic worldview, it's important to step away from some of our contemporary assumptions. I think that we assume that effusive emotion is feminine, and we assume that stoicism and restraint and control is masculine. And I think for the Kabbalists, it's actually not quite like that. For the Kabbalists, restraint happens on the left side of the Sefirot. Gvura, which is the primary location of restraint, is in the domain of the feminine, not the masculine. Bina, which is exacting, which is logical, which is precise, which is analytical, is feminine, not masculine when it comes to the cognitive, because the Sefirot are divided into three when we divide them horizontally, which is the cognitive, the emotive, and the expressive. So in the cognitive, it's the analytical, which is feminine. In the emotional, it's restraint. It's the ability to say no, to place boundaries, which is feminine. The masculine counterpart is chesed, which is all giving, which is boundless loving kindness, which is represented by Abraham, for Sarah. And then in the expressive Sefirot, we get into Netzach and Hod, which is maybe we can hold them up for a second. But just to say that the assumption that the feminine is sort of unbounded or just sort of gushing is actually not the Sephirotic idea not the Kabbalistic idea of the feminine. When the feminine gives forth in Malchut, receiving from Yesod, which is the central but also masculine, it's the phallic actually for the Kabbalists, which then gives the final moment of divine light in a metaphysical sense, inspiration or thought in the psychological sense, the final implanting the seed in the biological sense. When it gives over to Malchut, the responsibility of Malchut is to convey that in a way that's actually going to be viable and going to live on. When we speak a sentence, right? A sentence is constructed out of discrete syllables, words, and they have to make sense. They have to be sequential. If I just begin to blabber and speak in tongues, I'm not doing the role of the feminine malchut. I'm not giving over I'm not birthing that child, the idea, the artwork in a way that's comprehensible. So just to maybe add a bit to the texture of what the feminine means for the Kabbalists, and also to remind ourselves and those listening that, once again, for the Kabbalists, the masculine and the feminine do not take place within male and female bodies. They take place within all of our bodies and psyches. The entire process is present in every moment of reality, and in every human, as far as the Kabbalists are concerned.
I agree. To the extent that I understood what you said. I think I have the sense that you are speaking words and there's just it's like an iceberg. You're only speaking like the very top of what you understand. And it goes much deeper. But I totally agree that masculinity and femininity are held strongly in or potentially strongly in both men and women. And yet in Judaism, there is a separation of roles. And I don't know if it can be said that in like strict Orthodox Judaism, in the Judaism of old that we continue on today, if men and women are expected to hold both masculine and feminine traits in the same way, to the same extent, to the same level. And I'm perfectly happy to be wrong about that.
I think there's maybe a missing piece of the Orthodox puzzle here, insofar as I can. Orthodox is a weird word. Let's say Judaism, the Jewish puzzle. In classic Jewish texts and sources, beginning with the Bible, the instruction given to Adam and Eve in the beginnings of Genesis are Al-Kain ya'azev ish as aviv ves imei darak v'ishtei v'hoyel basar echad, that therefore shall a person abandon their father and mother, their parents, and cleave, cling, unite with their spouse and become one flesh, become one body. V'hoyel basar echad, become one body, is a very strange phrase, and many biblical commentators again seize upon this verse and phrase and try to make sense of it. And there are all kinds of different answers given. What does it mean to become one flesh? And there's some more practical and pragmatic answers that, for example, if and when two people have a child together, the child is a combination of the DNA of both of them. And in that sense, they are one flesh together. But there are other mystical commentators that comment differently. And they say that when two people come into a sacred union, they reveal the unity which always existed between them. There's a parallel in Plato's dialogues of his myth of humans, which begin conjoined as male, female, and they kind of like roll around to get from place to place, and then they become separate. And you have the same myth and I use myth in the most serious of ways in Judaism, where Adam and Eve are conjoined to one another, back to back, and then they need to be separated. And a process which, for the Kabbalists, is a psychological and metaphysical process of the severing of masculine and feminine from one another, so that they can be reunited and recombined face to face as one. And I think the understanding in Judaism, as filtered through Jewish mysticism, is that in a perfect coupling, those two bodies, which to our eyes seem to be separate, are really one body reunited. They're one soul that's come back together. They're the yin and yang that have found each other once again. And therefore, I think that from a Jewish perspective, if we're to speak indigenously about Judaism, we cannot fully speak, and I want to say this carefully, because this can be misconstrued and used as an excuse for oppression and misogyny, and I want to be careful that I'm not implying it that way. But I think in a sacred and in a holy context, when the masculine and feminine are perfectly balanced within a person, that person is the couple, and therefore the balance of masculine and feminine happens between the two of them, and also amongst them, and also independently, and also collectively. There's the four spirits of love that the Zohar speaks about, based on a verse in the Song of Songs, and kiss me with the kisses of your lips, because your love is better than wine. And the Zohar expounds upon why there's a double plurality in the verse. And the Zohar says that there are basically 4 movements of love in every couple. There's the couples as they offer themselves, the couple as they relate to another, and then the collectivity of the couple. And then the 5th is the Messianic spirit, which hovers in the face of the water, which is what comes from that union together. By all of this, is what I mean to say is that when we analyze a Jewish couple from within the lens of Judaism, we ought to see them as a reunited conglomerate as opposed to 2 separate entities. And that's the analysis worth doing. I will add to that as well, to be sensitive to those individuals where those heteronormative forms of union are prohibitive and oppressive and not available, frankly, that union can happen within a person, and that sense of unity can be there, and we can become united with God within ourselves and on our own as well. That's if that made sense, but that's a few points in relation to what you were saying.
Every time you say messianic, I get triggered. For the audience, when you Google things and you're trying to find out about Judaism, you look up, like, I was trying to do research into the components of the Yom Kippur service yesterday, and then, like, oftentimes a lot of the first results are Messianic Judaism, which is just Christianity in disguise. And that word, I don't hear that word used a lot in traditional Judaism, but it's refreshing to see it used in a different context. But I did want to say it's very interesting that you say that the couple is its own entity, because I have noticed that, like, if I am annoyed that my partner Elliot isn't doing something that I would consider masculine, he has many things that are masculine, but, like, if there's one particular thing that I'm annoyed about, my go-to is to express anger and try to get him to change in a very deliberate, like, nagging way. And that, in my interpretation, is a very masculine expression. And so my interpretation of what happens is that I don't give him space to take on, I'm taking up more masculinity in the couple, and I don't give him space to take up his own masculinity. But I've kind of realized recently that if I go against my first impulse and take on a space of what we call holding a container for him, for instance, and this is just one way to do things, but what I would call holding a container is asking him how he's doing, maybe in a specific context, and then allowing him to speak freely without interjecting any of my own issues or biases, especially negative biases, into the conversation, and just giving him a space to kind of speak his mind and his emotions and come up with his own solutions without mine intervening. Then it seems as if I do adopt that femininity, like, he has more room for masculinity, but also maybe I've just given him, on a more practical level, I think I can just give him more confidence in my trust in him. And then from a place of feeling confident and safe in himself, he can go out into the world and just kind of naturally take on a more masculine role. And I guess the messages or the models that I've received in women are generally more commanding or naggy based. And I think this is, I don't always, or even, like, I still struggle to take on a more feminine role, but I find that when I manage to do it, genuinely seems to help everything. Like the polarity is real. I think one party. Yeah, I would just. I'm sure it's probably the same for the men out there who are watching. Like if you're interested in your woman taking on a more feminine role. I'm just saying men and women just for the sake of it. Like whatever you are, just insert your own life into this. But if you're interested in, for instance, your woman taking on a more feminine role, I wonder if taking on a more masculine role might help as well. Although I'm not a man, I've never tried it, but I think I have this need to like concretize everything you say, to like so I can understand it in like in a real life context.
Yeah, the concrete from the perspective of the Kabbalists resides within the Sefirot, within the realm of Malchut, which is the feminine. The Malchut is that which is concretization. So that's apropos. Yeah, matter is feminine. Spirit is masculine for the Kabbalists as well.
Yes.
So the materialization of a concept is feminine. I just want to double down on what you said and agree. I think I'm speaking maybe somewhat abstractly, and I'm trying to be delicate to what's a very large universe within the world of the Kabbalists. And I don't want to say anything which is overly simplistic or reductionistic in regards to the vision of the Kabbalists when it comes to the masculine and feminine. But maybe for the sake of the medium, it might be helpful to say something which is a bit more actionable or pointed in lines with what you're saying. Which is that I think we live in a day and age where we're afraid to step into our own roles of masculinity and femininity. And I think that if we're able to live a little mythologically and to see these archetypes alive in our own lives, and to see the masculine as a mighty king and a warrior and a provider, and if we're able to see the feminine as a mighty queen, a nurturer and a shelter, and a mother, and again those apply to both men and women and we're able to champion that in one another and champion that in ourselves. The image of like the masculine for the Kabbalists is linear, is like a mighty sword, and the feminine is circular, is like a ring or a chalice. Like a golden chalice. And if we can elevate each other to those states of like mythological grandeur, I think there's particularly when there's such a crisis of not knowing who we are and how we can treat one another, if we're able to really step in depth into those mythological roles for ourselves and for each other with a great amount of dignity and almost an awe of what it means to be in the presence of the feminine, and an awe vice versa, what it means to be in the presence of the masculine. Like, maybe not all day, this might be a bit much to ask for, but in certain moments to tremble, in front of what it means to be standing in front of a representation of femininity or a representation of masculinity. Like these are powerful, powerful mythological images. And I think that we live in a world which is so, one-dimensional ontologically and so flat, in its metaphysics, that we've lost our capacity for that sense of awe and grandeur, and that affects every area of life, and particularly, I think, our interpersonal and intergendered relationships, and our intrapersonal and intergender relationships. And if we can tap into that, I think there's a richness of the poetry of life that we can enhance our own relationships and experiences thereby.
Yeah, absolutely. I really resonated with intergender relationships. Like, I am a huge fan of women's gatherings, and I want more men's gatherings too, where I think Judaism has these kind of built into the structure where there are a lot of gatherings for just men or just for women, and it's really beautiful. It's a different energy and it's a different vibe, and there's a certain connection. Yeah, it's just you can kind of, I mean, it's going into a woman's space, there's a really beautiful feminine energy that people intentionally tap into and put out, and it's so nourishing. I really love it. And there are so many aspects of religion that I think people who are atheists don't quite understand what they're missing out on. Like, and I don't know if they can replicate really very easily.
I would maybe just draw those lines.
Go on.
I would draw those lines maybe elsewhere. I think there are very religious atheists or non-theists. I think it's people with a sense of, sense for the religiosus, and that's both amongst theists and non-theists. I would just maybe draw that line a little elsewhere.
Zevi, we need clickbait. Okay, so I need you to say, "Shut up! You're an idiot." You're far too. We need Zevi destroys. Whatever, insert what you want to call me. I'm sure. Put in the comments what you would call me. I mean, let me know. But we need you to destroy me in the title. So, like, this you didn't get triggered at all. There's no anger.
I wonder, as someone who's involved,
you're absolutely right.
As someone who's involved in this internet world of ours, I wonder how we can collectively, because we're all building it, at ship, the ship at sea. I wonder how we can collectively build an internet where what's incentivized is compassion and humanity, and poetry and inwardness and silence, as opposed to destruction, obliteration, explosions and the pace of it all, which the internet in some ways is like this very great magnified mirror of what goes inside of us, and we have this morbid fascination with death and destruction, and the car crash that the internet is becoming. There's this sort of acceleration of violence and aggression and speed, and I wonder how we can collectively, as people that are creating the internet as we speak, envision a kinder reflection of our own internal psyche. Because there's part of our psyche which deeply cherishes beauty and respect, and I would love if there was an internet where it's like a man respects woman in all caps, and that goes viral as much as man destroys woman, because the reality is that the impulse for life which is slow, because life is slow, for dignity, for honor, for awe, for humility, for kindness is as strong an impulse. It's maybe a slower impulse. It's like having a well-cooked, balanced meal as opposed to some bars of candy. But I think if we're thinking about sustainability, we can envision a different and better internet together.
It's hard. I like your vision. I don't know how to get there. It makes me think of, I listened to this Dan Carlin podcast. It was an episode called Painfotainment, and it was he's a historian, and he talks about like gladiator arenas where they would torture, kill people, and most people showed up. And we think of it as something like barbaric from the past, but then he says, well, if there was a movie going on and it featured all the biggest celebrities, like nowadays, I guess Mr. Beast would be in it, just huge celebrities, Tom Cruise, whatever, insert your own. And they really died in the death scenes. They actually died. How many people do you think would see it? Like 30% of the population? 40, 50? would you see it? Like, and I think, I don't think we've changed since the days of the barbarians. I think death is still something it's always been attractive to us. Not attractive, but like a fire. I mean, you can't look away, really. It's so important to us. I guess important is the word. Like, death is an incredibly important thing, and avoiding death is 100 times more important to us, 1,000, 1,000,000 times more important to us than moving towards compassion, because one is so final. And compassion can be gained again, but death can't be. If you don't escape death once, it can't be escaped again. So, I think the internet is really built upon evolutionary psychology in this very deep way, and I like your idea. And there are little other issues. For instance, like you said, silence. But like, if I listen to a podcast by you and you say, go outside, go out, and you inspire me to go outside and touch grass, then I turn off YouTube, and then YouTube says, well, they watched this episode and then they all turned off the app. So we don't want that. And so even if I love it, I probably won't get recommended it very much again. And you're completely right. That's a beautiful world, but it goes against some foundational principles.
It's a good question. It's a good question of, can we dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? An age-old question. The answer of Jewish mysticism is yes, that the handle of the axe is built from the forest itself. So that's insofar as Jewish mysticism voices an opinion on that, the answer they give is in the affirmative. And in some senses, because it's a realization of the power that exists within those tools, and the necessity to not alienate those tools as other than God, but to see them as capacities of redemption as well, and to unlock the redemptive capacity which they contain within them, which is certainly a teaching that I was raised on when it came to my relationship to technology. And that's an active debate within traditional and religious societies. The notion that I was raised on was based on a rabbinic midrash that asks, why did God create gold in this world? And the answer is so that the temple could be adorned with beauty. And the answer there in the Hebrew is that God created nothing in this universe that is not for the glory of God. And if we can extract that language from its theological context, we can understand what that might mean in relationship to contemporary technology, including the internet and the tools at our disposal. And furthermore, I would say that just as death and destruction is fascinating and captivating, so is life, right? We can stare at a fire unceasingly. It draws us in. We can stare for hours, and the capacity of fire to destroy is immense. We could also stare at the face of a baby for hours, and the life and the innocence and the potential inherent within them is endless. We can stare at a waterfall for hours because water is that which gives life. And I think that life is as fascinating as death. And furthermore, I would say that the same way that fire can be used to destroy and burn and maim, fire can be used to warm and heat and cook and meld and mend. And death is beautiful. It's the winter which gives birth to spring. We live in a world where death and decay are so kept away from us, with our obsession with youth, and there's a real fear and hatred of death. There was no one a few centuries ago that hadn't spent time with a person who was deceased, and these days quite the opposite. And that's I think a defect in contemporary society. The rituals around death in Judaism are immensely beautiful. A body that has passed away is referred to as a sacred object. It's treated with the respect that we treat the Torah scroll, for example. We bathe it, we cleanse it with purifying waters at the hands of a holy brotherhood, Chevra Kadisha, or holy sisterhood that do that activity. And if we can reimagine our relationship with death and with destruction as an integral part of creation, as part of the cycle of life, then perhaps we can rethink the ways in which our fascinations with death and destruction might be coming from a place of divinity as much as our anger comes from a place of divinity.
Beautifully said. I think you're right. In this society, we have this fear of death, like fear of the unknown. I mean, even when someone dies, except for in Judaism, in typical Western culture, bodies are generally taken away very quickly. We don't spend time with them. I think so. In Judaism, the body has to be buried in 72 hours, and until then, someone has to sit with it the whole time, overnight, everything. And I think these religious traditions are so many layered. I don't want anyone to think that I'm giving an explanation of like the only reason this happens, but one of the reasons I think this happens is because we can fully mourn if we see the body and we spend time with the body. There's a process of mourning that allows us to see that they have passed. And even though intellectually we might know they may have passed, it's different to see the body. And it's healing to see the body. And there is a deep spiritual element there. And perhaps, just like you said, perhaps our society reflects a lot of people who have not properly mourned or who haven't properly been acquainted with death in the same way as we should be, or we were kind of built to be. I don't know exactly how to say that.
Yeah, death is really an integral part of life, and there's to imagine them as separate would be to imagine summer and winter as separate parts of life. And I think if we spent some more time in nature, we would see how the death and decay of one strata of vegetation of a tree is what gives birth to a new bed for mycelium and insects and flowers, and we'd see death as something much more alive than we think it is. And in Judaism, that's certainly the case. In Judaism, death is a moment of life, and Judaism classically believes in the resurrection of the dead, that the dead return and they continue to be part of the realm of life. Tehei nishmasat tzrura b'tzrura chaim is what we say about a person when they pass away, that may their soul be bound up in the bundle of eternal life. That again, it comes back to this question of, do we see parts of reality as other and separate and absent from divinity, from reality? And that's how we understand death, right? That the moment of cessation where we close our eyes and all ends, and that's terrifying. Or do we see it as part of the whole, as not alienated from the whole, right? To alienate it would be to be against mysticism. And in this case, I think also against Judaism. Or do we incorporate it as part of a cycle? And that's not an easy one, not a simple one, but one which is evidentially true, if I said that word right.
I found a lot of meaning in this exercise, so I'll offer it to the people listening. Sit with yourself and sit with your feelings around death, and just sit with what comes up. Not your thoughts, but your feelings. So like for me, there's fear. And then that gets transmuted into an acceptance and an awe. But then again, there's fear. And I'm not going to sit with that for 10 or 20 minutes like I would in this exercise, but it's something that I would urge you to explore. So it's very separate from thoughts, which are what I think happens after death, or a lot of thoughts that come up might distract me from feeling my feelings, because fear is very hard to feel sometimes. And so we want to go into thoughts of like, well, I'm not going to die for a while, or, you know, whatever other thoughts that come up, or like what I think will happen after death, or is there something after death? That's a thought. Like, I would urge you to sit down and really just sit with the feelings around death. Because I think that can be quite powerful. It has been for me, at least. And let me know in the comments what happened. Let me know if you got enlightened. I want to make a case for religious atheism. If you're feeling satisfied with the last section, if you're feeling satisfied at completion, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. Did you say that you want to make a case, or you want me to make a case? I didn't hear you correctly.
I want to make a case.
Oh, please.
You pointed out right after the conversation on femininity what I did, and I think I made a very I noticed that I did something where I took about 5 steps ahead in my mind and then just said words out loud without walking through the process, and so there was this like big gap of disconnectedness that I didn't explain, which I sometimes do, but. There's this problem with like true atheism, right? Which I would consider atheism without living in a structure of religion. So I think you can be a religious atheist. I am not, but I think you can be. And with traditional atheism, okay, I'll make a case for religion just before we start. So there's this thing that religion has, like what we just talked about with the ritual around death, where we sit with the body and we properly mourn it. And we're doing many other things as well, but that's one thing that happens. And because God has told us to, we do it. And there is no arguing with that command. You can't argue against someone you can't argue with God, right? I mean, you can, we do all the time, but I don't think you can win. And so because of that, and just a multitude of other rituals, especially in Judaism, so many rules and rituals, we have all these experiences that we benefit from. And you can say, like, well, with atheism, if I'm an atheist, I can just sit with the body. And that's true. You can. But you will have a family one day, and your children may not fully understand why you do it, or they may not want to. And then over time, I don't think as an atheist you can hold on to long-lasting structures like that. I don't think you can feasibly have a long-standing community with these deep and powerful rituals that people stick to if you have no God, because there's always someone to argue against if you are an atheist. And so my advocacy for religious atheism is, even if you don't believe in God, pretend that you do. But I'm interested to hear what you think.
What's coming up for me is the space between autonomy and heteronomy. Heteronomy. Between being commanded by something outside of us, in this case, God, it's heteronomy, and autonomy, and being compelled from within. I think that a lot of religion and the history of religion is built on heteronymous command, which is a classic understanding of what a mitzvah is in Judaism. We're commanded by an all-knowing, all-seeing divinity, for whatever reason or no particular reason at all. I do think, however, that the kernels of the deconstruction of that idea are seeded very early in Judaism, and they flourish and blossom later in Jewish mysticism, in Kabbalah and Chassidut. There's a kind of enigmatic statement in the Talmud that mitzvot betelat latid lavo, that in the time to come, in the end of days, in the eschaton, the mitzvot, the commandments, will be nullified. There's certain things that are prohibited in traditionally, classically in Judaism, that are very well known. For example, pig is not kosher in Judaism, and the sages say that in the end of days, pigs become kosher, which sounds like a joke almost. And there is an element of joke in the messianic understanding of Judaism. Joke and messianism are related. The way that these kind of strange enigmatic rabbinic passages are understood by Jewish mysticism, or at least one way I should say, is that what they're indicating is a shift from heteronomy to autonomy, from doing these things because we're told to do them by some sort of external alien deity, to understanding that they are our own desire, they are our own true will. We make God's will our will, and by doing so, we make our will God's will. And we realize that they're really just one will. And in that regard, I think there's a further place where the boundary of atheism and religiosity is again attenuated and whittled down. That if, at least from a redemptive standpoint, if we can truly understand why, for example, resting one day a week out of 7 days is really our own deepest desire and a bastion of our family life, of our inner mental health, of our spiritual well-being, then we do that. And we do that absolutely, not because some alien persona came down on a mountain and told us in the form of tablets to do so, but because it is our will, it is the will of reality, is God's will, as we are able to tap into it. So again, the messianic is a explosive and is a sort of dangerous and a boundary blurring nature to it, and I think that perhaps, if I can be audacious to suggest, that contemporary forms of religiosity, and I can speak for Judaism most intimately, are approaching that moment where we are able to participate in our own forms of religion, not because someone told us to do so, but because we understand that that is the will of reality. That when we see another person on the street who's hungry, we don't give them food or money to buy food because some God told us. We give them because we know that that is our deepest Jewish desire, and that is the desire of reality, and that is God's will. And we don't need to be commanded. And that is perhaps what the Talmud means when it says mitzvot betelat latid lavo, that we no longer need to be commanded, but Evan Mikir Tizak, the stone itself will yell out to us, or the fire itself will yell out to us, don't touch me, I'll burn you. And that reality itself becomes transparent and translucent to its own deepest desire.
It's profound. It's very interesting because I've had my own version of the same thoughts. Makes me feel good to see that that you are reflecting the same thing, because it's also what I've been searching for, and I have found in components in different people, but it's what I'm searching for in Judaism. Like it seems as if, to me, it feels as if the Enlightenment and the atheist movement has, in a way, burned off the veil of being forced, feeling like we are forced to do things, feeling like we're doing things because God says so. And it feels as if, or it seems as if, Judaism or religion Judaism also is going through a decline in, for instance, numbers and the amount of perhaps young people who are very interested in it. But to me, it is kindling for rebirth into exactly what you said, into people that understand that we should do mitzvot because we do want to do them, because they are in alignment with our higher selves, and not because we were told to do them. And I have the sense that we're entering into a new enlightenment, a different enlightenment, but a new rebirth, in a sense.
Yeah, in alignment with our deepest selves,
and in alignment with the religion. I don't think it involves restructuring the religion or changing it massively to be something other than what it is. More like seeing it in a different lens.
I'm only attempting to explicate Judaism here. I don't think anything that I've said is not directly from a Jewish source. Right. Yeah, it's certainly not a deconstruction of Judaism. It's an articulation of Judaism, which is sorely missing.
Yes, articulation. Yeah. So I wonder, why do we keep kosher? I have my own answers, but I'm wondering what your articulation of it is, and maybe we should explain what keeping kosher is. A very strict set of rules that eliminate most foods that people might eat generally. I mean, there are different versions of the same foods for the most part, but it's a very strict diet. And I'm wondering why you think that people that we keep kosher.
Why do you keep kosher, Serene?
What was that?
I asked, why do you keep kosher?
Why do I? Layers. There are always layers, but one that stands out to me is I think in evolutionary psychology a lot, and I think that makes up the fundamentals of a lot of my thought. So one of them is the importance of purity. I think all humans have a part of their brain designed for purity and impurity. And it's used for food. For instance, like you don't put rotten food with clean food. I think maybe that's foundationally somewhere along the lines of you don't feed someone rotten meat, for instance. You don't put food near sewage. And then I think, so that's, something we can all get across, all understand. And then as we evolved, our minds began to take on more and more complicated ideas, but we had only the same space as we had before. Maybe a little more space in the front of the brain, but mostly the same space. So, and purity is also separation between people, for instance. And in Judaism, there's this really beautiful structure that happens where purity is and impurity are almost never fully separated. Like you, if you have a field full of wheat, you should leave a corner of it unharvested for the poor. And there's this separation between purity, which would be completely harvesting the field, and impurity, which is leaving some of it to go to waste ostensibly or to give away. And tzitzis, which is colloquially known as prayer danglies, I think. But there are these cloths that men wear. I mean, I think the mitzvah is if you have a garment with four corners, the corner should be unwoven. I'm not nailing that exactly what the mitzvah is, but there's a part of your garment that should be unwoven. So the rest of it is in order, and then there should be a hint of chaos. And I mean, it goes on forever. There's on Pesach, there's some people will eat matzah balls on the last night, even though they rise. And that's a whole complicated thing. You don't eat bread that's risen, or that's not quite right, but you don't eat risen foods. I don't know how to explain that very succinctly, but on the last night you eat something that rises. And so I think kashrut and being kosher is one layer of reality, and there are many, and far more than I understand, is fully understanding and practicing purity because it's so deeply ingrained as part of the religion and such a fundamental part of the religion in ways that I do not comprehend. It's one layer. And another is that it separates you from the outside. It separates me from the outside. I'm only speaking about me, but being Jewish is different than not being Jewish. And it's difficult and it's amazing at the same time. But those are two that I can think of immediately. For context, I can't see you right now. We talked about this before the podcast, but I can't see him, and I'm profoundly worried that I've said the wrong thing and that you're sitting there offended at me.
Can you see me now?
I can see a flash of you now. I can see a single frame. That's okay. I don't need to see you. I was just speaking to the tension in myself.
Oh, I was sitting just in awe of your presence, of your beauty, of your articulation, of your depth, of an appreciation of what it is to be Jewish and to have voices join the tradition and to add on to the beauty that it is to be Jewish. I was sitting in great admiration and reverence.
Thank you. I don't always get it right, though. I'm converting right now. I'm almost finished, hopefully. Who knows? God willing. And I'm really feeling the struggle of wanting to do things properly. And also, at the end of the conversion, there's they'll ask me questions, and I don't want to lie. I try not to lie at all. But I'm feeling what seems to be a very universal feeling of arguing with God in a way that I know I will never win. But for instance, trying to keep fully kosher and then Yesterday, I just ate something without thinking. Like the old habits are still there. Or, I mean, that was a mistake, right? So that's not quite the same thing. But there were points recently when, for instance, I ate some fruit that was cut up without a kosher knife, and that was intentional. And there's this real sense of purity and impurity. And I wonder when they ask me whether I've been keeping kosher, what I should say, because I haven't been completely pure, but I don't think, I mean, I don't really know what it means to keep kosher, at what level it counts as keeping kosher. And at what level I'm lying. And I struggle with that a lot.
Do you know that you're loved?
Rationally, of course, but I don't feel it in this moment.
You know, there's a biblical commandment, there's a mitzvah that's repeated many times. V'ahavtem es hager. You should love the stranger. Also, the convert, depending on how you translate it. And if a mitzvah is a expression of the deepest desire of God and reality itself, then you are loved. And the only reason why it has to be a commandment is because we live in a state where our deepest desires are not evident to us. But if things were clear, we wouldn't even need to command that love. It would be self-evident, and we would feel it.
It makes me want to cry. Not quite to the point where I'm crying, but it hits me deeply. It's a very difficult process, converting. It takes over a year, just for context, and it's weekly lessons, and Judaism is a huge religion. It's incomprehensibly huge, and I'm only skimming the basics. And yeah, there's a constant fear that I'm not enough.
You know, when you said that, you reminded me of a story that's told of one of the great, beautiful early Hasidic masters, Zusha of Anipali. That when Zusha was dying, it was quite clear that he was afraid. And they asked him, Zusha, you're our master. You're a beautiful human. What are you afraid of? You know, it seems that you have nothing to fear. You lived a life of purity and kindness and devotion, worship, service, humility, presence. What are you afraid of? And he said, in words that have become immortalized, he said, I'm afraid that when I die, they won't ask me, why weren't you like Abraham? Why weren't you like Moses? Why weren't you like Isaiah and Jeremiah? I'm afraid that they'll ask me, why weren't you like Zusha? And for some reason, when you spoke about your own fear about facing a terrestrial court, weighing up your soul in some sense that's strange and bizarre and terrifying, that the fear is why, or am I, or can I be my true self? And by then I assume the question won't be directed to Serene. There'll be a Hebrew name that the question is directed to, and that's ultimately the most scary question we can ask ourselves. That why wasn't I like Zevi? Every day, I could have been so much more. I could have been so much larger and kinder and more thoughtful and more giving. And that's a question which I think rightfully terrifies us, but also hopefully motivates us to see that in becoming ourselves, we are embodying and becoming divine. And we become what the Kabbalists call a Merkava. We become the chariot of divinity in this world. We become the arms and legs and eyes and mouth of God. And when we're able to do that, then we are able to fulfill another biblical commandment, which is V'halachta b'drachav, to imitate God, imitato die, as the Christians have it. And what it means to imitate God, to walk in God's ways. Ask the Talmud. The Talmud says God is described as a consuming fire. Fire, as we said before, is dangerous and destructive, and you can't walk in the path of fire because it scorches the earth and it burns those who walk near it. And the Talmud answers that what it means to imitate God in the context of Judaism, in the context of a biblical faith, is that there are acts of God that we emulate. And it enumerates three in specific. God clothes the naked, Adam and Eve, when they're expelled from the garden, even in that act of abandonment and banishment and expulsion, God clothes them with the tools and with the garments that they'll need to survive in a harsh world. God, after commanding Abraham to circumcise himself at a ripe old age, visits him 3 days later at the peak of his agony. God visits the sick. And God, after instructing Moses to write his own death in the final verses of Deuteronomy, buries Moses himself in an undisclosed location because he did not want his tomb to become a site of worship that would distract people from divinity. And Moses is buried in an undisclosed location by God himself, and God in that act buries the dead. And the Talmud says what it means to be divine in Judaism, in a biblical light, is to bury the naked, is to visit and heal the sick, and is to comfort the mourning and bury the dead. And that's a scary task, because there's all kinds of other things that are interesting and exciting and enticing and glittery and glamorous in this world. And clothing the naked and burying the dead and visiting the sick, which stand as sort of models or representational mountaintops of kindness, and amongst them they incorporate the rest of a world of goodness and kindness. Those things aren't they're not sexy always. They're not glamorous. They're not gonna get all of the likes and attention, but they are divine. And when we do them, we feel that, and we know it, and we feel how divine they are, and we feel how right they are, and we feel how aligned and alive and beautiful they are, and how beautifying and enlivening they are. And when we can shift the center of our gravity away from a self-obsession, self-pleasure, self-aggrandizement, and we can shift that to the other, both in the masculine and feminine paradigms of doing that, we can experience that divinity for ourselves. And it's sweet. Ta'amuru Kitev Hashem, taste and see, says the psalmist, that God is good, that godliness is good. Dawk in Arabic is the term for tasting divinity. And I invite people to go out and taste it, taste what it's like to spend an evening of your life volunteering with the hungry, the hurting, the downtrodden, the marginalized, the oppressed. Spend a week, spend a month, devoting your efforts and your talents and your skills to uplifting others and inspiring and educating and enriching and fortifying and supporting. And it's sweet as God.
Baruch Hashem.
Alhamdulillah.
I think now is a good time to finish off. I don't think I can find any words more beautiful than that.
Thank you.
Zevi can be found at Seekers of Unity on YouTube. And I highly encourage you to go and watch every single thing he has put out. You will be changed. You will come out of his channel a different person, as have I. I think this conversation has changed me.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll finish there. Goodbye, everyone.